Fantastic. It's interesting, both in the songs and in the words that Lorna and Kathy brought, the word freedom was a word that's come up quite a lot and seems to be keep coming back to, and is a word that's really on my kind of heart and things for this morning as well, and what I feel God's kind of put on my heart to share. And I mentioned earlier, a number of us went across to Normandy with Steve Lee earlier this year, and there was a phrase that he kept coming back to, and he shared a number of times while we were there where he said this. He said, freedom is found on the other side of sacrifice. And it was a phrase that he used a number of times, and it's stuck with me, and it's made me think. And he was obviously sharing that in the context of looking particularly at World War II, which is in the area where we were, and things. And if you think about World War I and World War II, every Allied soldier would say that they were fighting for freedom, and that the freedom that we enjoy as a nation has been found on the other side of their sacrifice. And then in the songs that we've been singing about and everything that, we've been kind of focused on in the words that we've just had through Lorna and Kathy, when we think about Jesus, we see something very similar. That Jesus laid down his life. He paid the price. He went to the cross. He tore the veil. He sacrificed himself so that your freedom could be found on the other side of his sacrifice. This is what Jesus himself says in John 8, verse 36. He says this, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And Paul writes this in Galatians 5, verse 1, that it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. And I don't know about you, but freedom is one of those words that is just so appealing, is so attractive. It's one of those words that captures so much of what it is that I long for and want in my life and want to see in the lives of others and want to see around us in our nation. It's a word that kind of, it just kind of draws you in, doesn't it? It kind of captures your imagination in some way, even though it's not always that easy to define. What does it really mean and what does it really look like? And so today we're continuing our series, A Better Way. But what I really want to talk about is the way, this is all about us learning from Jesus. As Jesus invites us to learn a different way of doing life, to learn a better way of doing life from him. And, that as a Christian, that it means more than just believing in who Jesus is and that he died for us and all of that kind of thing. It's embracing Jesus' invitation, his call to follow him, to learn from him, to do life his way. That's what it's all about. And as we kind of focus in on that, really today what I want us to be looking at is what does Jesus invite us to learn from him when it comes to the way of freedom? When it comes to finding a life of freedom where we know that kind of peace and joy, and we live with that sense of purpose and all of the rest of it. What is the way of freedom that Jesus has for us? And I say freedom's not always an easy word to really kind of nail down. So before we go any kind of further, I think we've got to kind of ask that question, what is freedom? What does a life of freedom really look like? And I want you to think about it for a moment. You can either think about it on your own or turn and have a chat to somebody near you or next to you and just just going to give you a minute. What actually is freedom? We talk about it a lot, but what is it? I'll give you a minute. Go for it. Okay, so we come back together again. What do you think? Anyone brave enough to shout out and give us an idea? What is freedom? What are your thoughts? To be able to choose. Yeah, great. Thanks, Martha. Freedom from worry. Yeah, so it can be freedom from as well as freedom to. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Lim. Yeah, anyone else? Unshackled. Yeah, great, George. Like it. That's good. Not to be persecuted or confined by others. Yeah, great, David. Thank you. So really great answers, different thoughts and things. I don't know, maybe you had some other thoughts or different discussions and things. Here's the idea of freedom that I think that the world wants you to believe. Because I keep coming back to this idea that if we want to embrace and learn the way of Jesus, we've first got to recognize and unlearn the way of the world. And so here's an idea that in terms of freedom, I think the world wants you to believe that freedom is the ability to be whoever you want to be and to do whatever you want to do. That's the kind of the way that the world would kind of talk about freedom. I don't really follow pop music. In fact, my musical knowledge is probably decades out of date at this point. But one of the most kind of popular kind of current singers, artists in recent years is an American girl called Billie Eilish. And some of you will know her. A few years ago, she did an interview with Vogue, and this is what she said. She said, "My thing is that I can do whatever I want. It's all about what makes you feel good." I think that's a great summary of what the world teaches us freedom looks like. If we stick with the musical theme, lots of you know little Annabelle. She's not so into it these days, but for years and years she was massively into Frozen. So to quote another kind of musical kind of thing, Elsa, Let It Go, sings these words. She says, "No right, no wrong, no rules for me. I'm free." That's this idea of what real freedom looks like that the world tries to kind of teach us and to form us with. That it says this freedom will bring you that sense of release to be yourself and to be happy. Freedom from every restraint, every limit, every rule. The freedom to be whoever you want to be and to do whatever you want to do. And on the surface, that sounds great, doesn't it? It's really appealing and it's attractive. You be you and I'll be me. Let's all just be free to be ourselves, to do what makes us happy with no restraints, no judgments, no kind of calling each other out. And it sounds great, and it might be that a lot of you are kind of sat there thinking, actually, do you know what? Isn't that what freedom is? Here's the problem. It doesn't work. In a world that holds up this kind of freedom as what it is that we want to be taking hold of, as the thing for us to aim for if we're going to feel free inside, how many people do you know who actually do feel free inside? How many people are really at peace with themselves and who they are? Are you? Here's a different definition of freedom that I think is a lot more helpful. Instead of freedom being understood as the ability to do whatever you want or to be whoever you want, how about this? Freedom is the ability to flourish. And here's the thing. If you want something to flourish, to be at its best, there are always guidelines that you need to follow. There are good things to feed an animal and bad things to feed an animal if you want it to flourish. There are good techniques to use and bad techniques to use, if you want to see your garden grow. I've talked about musical things a couple of times, and, I often come back to musical things just because that's kind of my background with things. But, take an instrument. Take it if I was going to try and play the piano here. If I want to be free to do whatever I want, so I just kind of bash the notes any way that I want to do, am I really going to be free in that moment as a pianist to make music? Or if I actually embrace and accept and submit to the rules of music, to the rules of the way that intervals work between the notes, and so what goes together and the different things, kind of emotions that stirs up as you do it, and the techniques that you need to use in order for your fingers to be able to flow over the keys. Who's really free as a pianist? The one who does whatever they want? Or the one who's embraced and submitted to the guidelines and to the rules that have enabled them to flourish? Freedom is not the ability to do whatever I want. Freedom is the ability to flourish. And flourishing requires not just impulsively kind of being driven by our desires, but actually submitting to some rules. Or as we've been talking about it, put it in a language, because we don't really like the language of rules. We immediately kind of go, ooh, don't like that. That's controlling. Let's talk about it in a different way. It simply requires submitting to a better way of doing things. A better way of life. So we're going to zoom in on Jesus and the way of life that he teaches us and models to us in a moment. But before we do, I want to take a quick look. You know, I read the beginnings of a verse earlier on, Galatians 5, verse 1, the very start of it. I want to kind of come back to that again. As he goes on, Paul says this. If we read the whole of verse 1, it says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Jumping ahead a little to verse 13, Paul goes on, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another in love, humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh." And I love this bit. "They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want." And in this great passage, which is all about freedom, and how it is for freedom that Christ has set us free, Paul makes this statement that just flies in the face of everything that our world would teach us that freedom looks like. Freedom is not an excuse, in Paul's words, to gratify the desires of the flesh or to indulge the flesh by doing whatever we want to do. He talks about this kind of war that's going on within us, this conflict within us between the flesh and the Spirit. And I think while we might find that language unfamiliar, we can all relate to this idea of conflict within us being pulled in different directions, of actually, you know, this competing desires within us. As the flesh, actually, Paul's language says, leads us into the way of slavery, and the Spirit leads us into the way of freedom. And what Paul really means, because I say this is strange language, we don't use this kind of language in kind of day-to-day stuff, but what Paul really means when he's talking about the flesh is the desires, it's the passions, it's the kind of the drives and impulses within us. The kind of craving within you that calls out to be satisfied in the moment. Whether it's, I don't know, take a few, here's one that I would find, whether it's your fifth donut, when you bought a pack of 5 because there's 5 in your family, or whether it's your next pint or your next high. Whether it's the drive to succeed that actually pulls you to such an extent that you're willing to pull another person down or to cheat to get what you want. Or that juicy bit of gossip that you just can't help but need to share. Or that website or those images that just keep calling you back again, saying, come have a look. Paul says these acts of the flesh are obvious. We all know them. We experience them. We live with them. These are strong desires within us that demand to be satisfied and promise us that we'll be happy if we do. That we'll feel good in that moment. And desire isn't always a bad thing. We can have desires for good things. But when this impulse, when this desire becomes something that you are not able to say no to, the reality is that you're no longer free. Doing whatever we want is not the way of freedom, but the way of slavery. Because what happens is that we actually end up becoming controlled by our desires. We're enslaved to our desires, and we can't help but have to satisfy them and do that thing that's going to make us feel good. And the desires don't actually lead us to flourishing, but to feeling torn and in conflict inside. In another letter in the New Testament, Peter puts it like this. He's talking about false teachers. That's the context. And then he says this, these false teachers, they promise them freedom because we all want freedom, while they themselves are slaves of depravity. For people are slaves to whatever has mastered them. See, there is a battle going on within you between the flesh and the spirit, between the strong, impulsive desires that pull at you moment by moment, that demand to be satisfied, and the deep down desire that can often be a lot quieter and more subtle, but is constant and is there, longing within you for true freedom, longing within you for a life of flourishing, a life with God. And I don't know if you relate to any of that, but I definitely do. And here's a reality that I find, and maybe you relate to this too. Often I want the best of both worlds. I want to follow Jesus as my king, and I want to be able to make my own choices and choose what I want. I want to have patience, but I don't want to have to wait. I want deep intimacy with God, but I don't want to get out of my bed in the morning where I'm cozy and warm and spend that time with him. That's a snapshot of the battle within me between the flesh and the spirit. And maybe you can relate to something of that in you too. So how do we win this battle? What do we learn from Jesus about what the way of freedom looks like, or how we live this out? How do we embrace the way of freedom in our lives so that we flourish? Well, if we go back to Galatians 5, after Paul describes the things of the flesh, if you go on, I really encourage you, Galatians 5, fantastic chapter. Take time, read it, spend time in it this week. But we're going to jump ahead as he's gone on, and he describes what these things of the flesh look like, and then he describes what the fruit of the Spirit looks like, what the way of freedom kind of looks like. But then he goes on, and it's actually pretty shocking what he says. It goes against pretty much everything that the world would teach you as to what freedom or how to find freedom is. He says this. Verse 24, those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. And that really brings me back to the phrase that I shared at the start from Steve Lee, that freedom is found on the other side of sacrifice. And we see this with Jesus too. Straight after he's talked to his disciples about how he's going to go to the cross to die, how he's going to sacrifice himself for our freedom, he then says this in Luke 9, starting verse 23. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self? You see, for Jesus, the cross was not just a one-off event when he laid down his life for your freedom and for mine, so that we could be forgiven. The cross was a way of life. Daily, Jesus says we're to do this. It's a way of life that he calls everyone who follows him to, because he knows that the way of the cross is the way of freedom. What Jesus is essentially saying is, if you want to experience the way of freedom, to have freedom, to flourish, to have real life, and life to the full, the life of the Spirit, then you need to put to death the flesh. And he says, and if you try to satisfy the desires of the flesh, essentially if you try to gain the whole world, that's his language that he uses for that, to get everything that you want, what good will it do you? Because you will lose the life of the Spirit. you will lose your real freedom. You will forfeit, in Jesus' words, your very self and become a slave to your own desire, a slave to sin. I really love the way John Mark Comer puts this in a great book. If you want to dig into this kind of stuff deeper, he's written a book called Live No Lies, and he made this statement as part of it. He said, you don't manage your flesh or keep it in check. You launch a militant campaign to kill it. And that's what both Jesus and Paul are saying. This is the better way that Jesus invites us to as we follow him. Jesus is saying that if you want to follow me, to say yes to me, that means saying no to 1,000 other things. Saying no to simply doing whatever you want to do and being ruled by your flesh. So that instead you become someone who has made Jesus king, who is ruled by the Spirit, knowing that actually it's as you submit to his ways that you will find the freedom to flourish. This is why freedom is found on the other side of sacrifice. Because it requires daily taking up your cross, daily denying yourself, and saying to Jesus, whatever, wherever, whenever, however, I am yours. And this is challenging, isn't it? You know, I think we're all a work in progress when it comes to this. I don't know how true this story is, but it illustrates the point, so I'm going to share it anyway. But I heard a story earlier this week about the Knights Templar, and how the Knights Templar, you know, so if you don't know, the Knights Templar were kind of these religious zealots who killed a lot of people and did a lot of horrible stuff, but all in the name of faith. And during the Crusades, as part of this, they would get baptized wearing their full armor, but they would hold their sword up out of the water. And it was almost like this way of saying to God, God, I'm giving my life over to you. I'm dying to self with everything apart from this, except for my commitment to violence and killing and making that my career. And it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I think just getting baptized in full armor sounds ridiculous. But, you know, but the idea of kind of holding up this and saying everything but this. And yet, how easily can we do something similar? Can we make a commitment to following Jesus while holding back this one thing, saying to Jesus, I'm yours, I want to give my life to you, I want to follow you, apart from this that I want to hold on to? I want to follow you, but I still want to be able to make my own choices, thanks. But Jesus is saying, if you try to save your life, if you try to save the flesh, to hold on to things, you're going to lose the life of the Spirit. You're going to lose the freedom to flourish. And Jesus, he doesn't make this optional for us. You know, sometimes we hold all this kind of stuff up like it's this kind of radical way of following Jesus, but it's all right, we can just be here. But Jesus, he doesn't say that. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple, that's anyone and everyone who wants to follow Jesus and find life in him must, not, well, they can if they want to, or if they want to be up here, but it's all right if they're down here. No, must deny themselves and take up their cross daily. You know, this is at the very core of the better way that Jesus invites us to. It's at the absolute foundation of what it looks like to follow him. And yet it goes completely against everything about the way that the world has shaped us and tries to form us to do life. The good news is that Jesus, he also gives us a great promise. When he says, those who deny themselves and take up their cross daily, who lose their lives for him, he simply says they will save them. What he really means is they will be the ones who really actually gain life. Jesus is called to die to self. You know, the world would try and make out that this whole idea, this whole principle is kind of this call to die to self is a call to a life of misery. You know, and why on earth would you want to do that? Why would you want to subject yourself to that? You know, you're just going to make yourself miserable. But actually, what Jesus tells us is it's the action that we are called to in order to live life with real freedom, with real joy, with real peace. It's the way that we're called to do life that is so much better. It's the price we have to pay in order to get what we actually really want. And we get a great picture of this in what Jesus says in Matthew 13, verse 44. He says this, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field." It wasn't for a life of misery. It was with joy that he sacrificed everything that he had because he knew what he was going to get was so much better. Jesus' way really is a better way. It doesn't make it an easy way because it does cost us. And the real challenge is that cost of denying ourselves, is really obvious because the pain is immediate. You know what it's like when you satisfy the desire of the flesh in the moment, in the immediate, you do feel good. But the moment later, you feel horrendous. And when you deny the flesh, in the moment, you don't feel good. In the moment, it genuinely does cost you, and it's painful. But at the moment afterwards, you find life. So it isn't an easy thing because it genuinely does cost us in the moment. But to hold on to life, to hold on to the things of the flesh, to do life in our own way, the way the world has taught us to do, it costs us so much more because actually it means we give up the treasure. We give up the freedom to flourish. The cost is greater. When we choose to satisfy the surface desires, I think this is a helpful way of thinking about it, is these surface desires are like immediate desires that pull at us. And when we choose to satisfy the surface desires, it means sacrificing the deep desires. It costs us the deep desires that are underneath, that are maybe not quite so apparent in that moment, but are really there, what we really need, the desires of the Spirit. And so we will never find contentment or satisfaction or that kind of internal peace that we actually long for. What is on offer is greater than what it will cost us. Here's the big question then. How do we do this? What does it really look like to walk in the way of freedom? In the way that Jesus and Paul have kind of talked about it. And I think one of the verses we read earlier from Galatians 5 is really helpful for this in kind of bringing two aspects of it together. Paul says this. He says, "Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit." In other words, what does the way of freedom look like? Well, Paul says this. It looks like this. Crucify or kill the flesh. In the words of John Mark Comer, go on a militant campaign against it. And instead live by the Spirit. I think a really helpful way of thinking about the flesh and the Spirit, or one that I found helpful anyway, hope that you will too, is to think about them as two different appetites. Two different appetites. You know, an appetite is a desire. So think about two different appetites within you. And then ask yourself the question, how do you shrink or grow an appetite? How do you kill or bring life to an appetite? And to kill an appetite, what you do is you starve it. And to grow an appetite, what you do is you feed it. And so we're to starve the flesh and to feed the Spirit. And both are really important. Either one of them alone, and I think we have a tendency to try and go it with one or the other. and either one of them alone, and we're going to struggle. You see, to starve the flesh is simply, I just think of it simply this way: you use your willpower. You're using your willpower, your self-control to say no. To say no to that desire within you, to stop doing things, to refuse to react in that kind of a way, and to kind of hold your tongue. It's basically the muscle of self-control that you use if you've ever tried to do a diet or an exercise regime. And your willpower, your self-control is needed and it is important, but how many of you know that it isn't enough? You know, it might be enough to succeed in a diet. I don't know, maybe you've done better than me in those kind of things. But when we want to break free of a cycle of thinking or behavior that is so deeply formed within us, that drives us, that demands and calls to be satisfied, it's a different matter, isn't it? And so at the same time as starving the flesh, of using our willpower to say no, we need to feed the Spirit. To not just give up something, but to take hold of something. To take hold of the good that Jesus has for us, to take time with him in prayer, to feed ourselves on his truth with his word. To be a part of his church and his family where we're able to be encouraged and built up and we're able to serve and to give. To essentially just choose the better way of Jesus. But again, take that in isolation and it's not enough. If we don't engage our willpower, it doesn't matter how much you might pray and ask God, would you take this away from me? You'll still find yourself struggling with it. It takes both. We need to starve the flesh. We need to use our willpower. We need to recognize that we need to live by the Spirit, to feed the Spirit, to recognize that we need him, that we can't do it on our own. And there's one activity that we see all throughout the Bible that Jesus talks about and is in the Old Testament, it's in the New Testament, that I think is a God-given tool to help us do both these things at the same time. It's called fasting. Fasting is simply when we give something up, when we starve an appetite within us. We say no to our flesh because we want to intentionally pursue the Spirit. And for hundreds of years, the church fasted twice a week, on every Wednesday and every Friday. It was simply an accepted part of, this is what it means, this is part of what it looks like to embrace the way of Jesus. And usually it involves food. You know, whether it's a total fast for like 24 hours of not having any food, whether it's a partial fast when it's particular meals or a particular type of food. There's a cost that's involved with fasting. But what is going on is that we are making a choice. We are making a choice to literally deny ourselves something. And so it's painful. It costs us in the moment. It's not always enjoyable. But through it, you are starving the flesh and feeding the Spirit as you then intentionally take time to pursue God and to pursue him. And as you do that, you are breaking the power of your flesh. You're breaking the power of the desires within you that pull at you, not just for the thing that you're fasting, but just in general. You're embracing and kind of doing something to say, I want to break the addiction to self-gratification, break the addiction to getting what I want when I want it, which is the exact thing that our world teaches us we should be aiming for. And this is why, as we do that, we're making a choice. We're making a choice and saying, this is in my control. I'm not going to be ruled by the flesh. I'm not going to be ruled by my desires. I'm going to starve the flesh. And when you do that by choice, when it happens and it's not your choice, it means you don't freak out so much. Because when you never do it by choice, and then someone else does something which it gets at your flesh, it means you don't get what you want. My goodness me, we don't like it, do we? But when we do it by choice, it means we're kind of used to the pain. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, but it means that we cope an awful lot better when it does. Because we're no longer living to feed the flesh, we're living to feed the Spirit. And as we do that, the way that people treat us, the circumstances that we face, the situations that we're in the midst of all of it, we've learned the secret to be content, to have joy and to have peace, whatever it is that goes on around us. And so we have freedom to flourish, and this is why freedom is found on the other side of sacrifice. This is why denying yourself and taking up your cross daily is actually the way of freedom. It's not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced. Do you know, the people who I know who are the most happy and the most at peace and grateful and content, who enjoy their life deeply, they're not miserable people, they enjoy their life deeply, and they're loving and they're kind, and they will sacrificially give. They have a life that you look at it and you go, they're living free. Do you know, pretty much always they're the people who I know who have most learned how to die to self. Freedom, the ability to flourish, comes from taking up your cross, from choosing to live not for the flesh but the Spirit, from placing ourselves not in the position where we can do whatever we want, but placing ourselves under the rule, under the kingship of Jesus as we choose his better way. And so I want to encourage you this week, if you haven't ever done it before, give fasting a go. Not as a one-off. I think often in my life I've kind of done it as a one-off thing. But I want to encourage you to do it as part of something that you build into each week. Because it's not about just kind of, sometimes we treat fasting in this way where we're going to fast because we really want to see God move, and there's a place for that. But this is what we're being taught in this, what Jesus is teaching us in this, is that actually fasting is part of a lifestyle. It's part of a lifestyle of starving the flesh and feeding the spirit so that you can find freedom. And so I encourage you to find a way where you're going to fast every week for the next month. Ask God how you can starve the flesh and feed the spirit, how you can give something up and create space to intentionally pursue him. And then at the end of the month, keep it going. And then at the end of the month, ask yourself, how's it gone? What's the difference that you've felt? How do you feel? What have you learned? What's God done? But even without thinking about kind of fasting in that kind of way, do you know, you have 1,000 choices, 1,000 chances to deny yourself this week. 1,000 times when you will have a choice to make between the flesh and the spirit, between clicking on that website or turning off your phone, between yes and no. And the better way that Jesus is inviting you to learn from him involves denying yourself and taking up your cross daily. It involves 1,000 small deaths so that you can experience and enjoy and live in the beauty of one massive life with real freedom, freedom to flourish. And I guess the question really then becomes, do you actually believe that? Do you trust Jesus? Do you trust that his way really is a better way? That he is a good king who has good intentions for you. And so you can submit to him and surrender to him and allow him rule. And give over to your life to him, because that's the way to freedom and to life. I'm going to ask Beth and the band to come up, and we're going to go into communion. And this is a time, communion is a time when we remember the greatest sacrifice as Jesus laid down his life for us so that we could find freedom on the other side of his sacrifice, so that we could be forgiven, we could be made whole, we could have that curtain torn that we talked about earlier and enter into his presence, have relationship with him. But as we come to communion, I want to encourage you to do three different things. I want to encourage you first to do this. First, to visualize Jesus on the cross, knowing that he died in your place, that he has paid the price for every time that you've ever chosen the flesh over the Spirit. Every time you've given in or you've got it wrong. Every time you've lost your temper. And that today as you come to him, there is no condemnation. This is not about guilt. That today as you come to him, as you visualize him there on the cross and you look to him and you come to him, he has mercy and forgiveness and grace for you. He wants to wash you clean and make you new. That's the first thing that I want you to encourage you to do is just to receive from Jesus the freedom that he has made available to you on the other side of his sacrifice. But after you've done that, I want to encourage you to do this. Ask Jesus a question. Ask him, Jesus, is there something in my life that has to die in order that I might truly live? Is there something in my life that has to die in order that I might truly live? And then I want to encourage you, just as you visualize Jesus on the cross, to visualize yourself taking up your cross, climbing onto the cross with him, allowing the nails to be driven through as you crucify the desires of your flesh. As you come to Jesus and say, I am choosing your better way, submitted to your rule. And the third thing I want you to do is to remember that the cross is only half the story. That Jesus conquered death and rose again, that he has the victory. And so I want you to encourage you, after you've done that, to then visualize yourself walking out of the grave with Jesus, receiving life from him, having been set free by him, that this isn't just about a death, but this is about receiving life, receiving freedom from him to flourish. Because I believe that's God's heart for you today in all of this. If the guys I've asked could come in to help serve, and that would be great. The Lord Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it, saying, "This is my body broken for you. Do this as often as you eat it in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup. He said, "This is the cup of my blood, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Jesus, we just want to thank you that we can come, that we can remember, we can celebrate what you have done for us, that you have died on the cross, that you sacrificed yourself so that we might find freedom, that we might find forgiveness, we might find life in you, and we want to rejoice and praise you and thank you. Lord, we just recognize, though, at the same time, the ways in which we have not chosen your way, but our own. The ways in which we've chosen to feed our flesh, to be enslaved to our desires. And Lord, I just ask that you would come now and that you would both minister your mercy and your forgiveness and your grace to each and every one of us, but that you would also move by your Spirit to break off those chains, to break off cycles of thinking and behavior, to bring freedom into our lives. And that you would strengthen us and give us the conviction to partner with you in the work that you are doing by your Spirit, that we would choose your way, that we would say, I'm willing to die to myself, to take up my cross, that I might find real life with you. Lord, I just pray that this would be a significant moment as we come to you, as we look to you, that we would not only receive from you forgiveness, but we would receive from you empowerment and equipping to walk your better way. That we would find freedom to flourish. In Jesus' name, Amen.